Why observing your thoughts changes them. Buddha's wisdom on true mindfulness. From very early in life, there is an assumption running underneath everything we experience. My thoughts are me, what I think is who I am. It's so deeply embedded that it doesn't feel like an assumption. It feels like reality. The Buddha challenged this directly. In the Anatalakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the not-self characteristic, delivered to the first 5 monks who followed him, he broke down the entire human experience into 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And for each one he pointed out, if these were truly self, you could command them. But you can't. If thoughts were truly yours, you could say, "Stop worrying," and the mind would obey. But it's the middle of the night. You need sleep. Tomorrow matters. And the mind keeps running, replaying a conversation from hours ago, jumping to next week's worries, circling back to something that stung 3 years ago. You want it to stop. You plead with it. It won't. And in that moment, lying in the dark, exhausted, held hostage by your own thinking, you are face to face with the truth the Buddha pointed to. If these thoughts were really mine, I could command them. I can't. So perhaps this sense of ownership, this feeling that there is a me in charge of the thinking, was never as solid as it seemed. He went further. He taught that thoughts are conditioned phenomena, sankhata dhamma. Every thought is assembled from ingredients, like a fire that needs fuel, oxygen, and heat. A worried thought about failing needs a memory of past failure, a feeling of tightness in the body, a habit of self-doubt reinforced since childhood, and most critically, unconscious identification, the automatic belief that this thought is reality. This is dependent origination, paticcasamuppada. Everything arises because conditions are present, and ceases when those conditions shift. Every thought is a structure held up by these pillars. When genuine awareness meets a thought, one of the most critical pillars gets disturbed: unconscious identification. The moment you observe a thought, you are no longer fully merged with it. And a thought you're no longer merged with cannot hold the same power it had when it was running in the dark. There's one more layer. What we experience as a continuous stream of thought is not actually continuous. It is a rapid sequence of individual mental moments, each one arising, lasting an impossibly brief instant, and vanishing. The speed creates an illusion of seamlessness, like film frames producing the appearance of smooth motion. A worry you're unaware of feels dense, heavy, permanent. But the moment awareness touches it, you notice it fluctuating. Stronger, then weaker. Nearly gone, then surging back. It's not a block of stone, it's a flame, and flames waver. If thoughts are conditioned and impermanent, then observing them should change something. But everything depends on what observing actually means. And this is where most people go wrong without realizing it. Most people, when they try to observe their thoughts, end up doing the opposite. They're angry. They've heard they should observe. So they try. Why am I angry? I shouldn't be angry. The book says to observe, so I'm observing. Am I doing it right? I'm still angry. Maybe something's wrong with me. This isn't observation. This is a second layer of thinking piled on top of the first. Wearing a spiritual costume, but generating more noise, more judgment, more agitation. Fuel on the fire while believing you're pouring water. The Buddha was precise about this. The Pali word he used in the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, is pajanati, which means direct knowing, immediate recognition, without conceptual elaboration. The instruction in the section on contemplating the mind is almost startlingly bare. When the mind has anger, one clearly knows the mind has anger. When the mind is without anger, one clearly knows the mind is without anger. No step between the anger and the knowing. No analysis. No why. Just knowing. The way you know it's raining when you hear rain on the roof. You don't need to explain the rain or have an opinion about it. Rain is falling, and you know it. That's the whole thing. The distinction between knowing and thinking about is the heart of the Buddha's approach to the mind. Thinking about a thought adds content and keeps you at the center of the drama. Why is this happening to me? What should I do? What does this say about me? Knowing adds nothing. It illuminates what is already present, the way a mirror shows what's there without creating anything new. Observation in this sense doesn't require a meditation cushion. The Satipatthana Sutta never says sit down first, then know. The instruction is to know, right where you are, right in the middle of life. It's a quality of mind that, with training, becomes woven into how you move through each day. When you're washing dishes, you know you're washing dishes. When you're walking, you know you're walking. When anger arises, you know anger has arisen. Not later, in retrospect. Right then, in the living moment. In the numbered discourses, the Buddha compared this kind of inner work to looking into a clean mirror, not to admire yourself, but to honestly see what's there. If there's a blemish, you address it, not out of shame, out of care. He listed the kinds of questions a practitioner should regularly ask. Am I often covetous? Am I often irritable? Am I often restless? Not to punish yourself, but the way a good doctor examines a patient, gently and thoroughly, so the right care can begin. This willingness to look at yourself with honesty and without turning away, that is the starting point of everything that follows. Now that we understand what observation actually is, direct knowing, not thinking about, the question becomes, what happens when that quality of awareness meets a thought in real life? Someone criticizes you. In under a second, heat rises to your face, your chest tightens, your jaw locks, and inside your head a voice is already composing a defense, a counterattack, a list of everything they've done wrong. There was no decision to get angry. The anger simply took over. There is no distance between you and the hurt. You didn't have a reaction. You became the reaction. The other person is now the enemy. And you are the one who must prove you are not as small as their words just made you feel. Then, seconds later, maybe minutes, a flash of direct knowing. I'm furious right now. Where there was one fused experience, me being angry, now there are two things, the anger and the knowing that anger is present. A small gap opens. Before that flash, anger had full access to your voice, your face, your decisions. It was making choices on your behalf, and you had no say. After the flash, the anger is still burning. You can feel it in your chest, your jaw, the heat in your face, but it's no longer the only thing in the room. Something in you has stepped wider than the anger, and from that wider place, its authority is no longer absolute. For the first time, you and the anger are not the same thing. This is not a thought about the anger. This is not an analysis. This is the direct knowing we explored. And in real time, inside a real emotion, it changes the entire landscape. The Abhidhamma, Buddhism's most detailed psychological framework, describes what happens here with great precision. Wholesome mental factors and unwholesome mental factors cannot exist in the same moment of consciousness. Mindfulness, sati, is wholesome. Anger, Dosa is unwholesome. They cannot share the same instant of mind. The moment genuine mindfulness arises, the moment of anger has already ended. Mindfulness didn't fight the anger. Its arising is the ending of that particular moment of anger. The anger may return in the next instant, but each time mindfulness appears, the unwholesome sequence breaks. The way light entering a dark room simply makes it impossible for darkness to remain. In daily life, this shows up in a way you can feel. Normally, the chain runs without gaps. Someone says something hurtful. Anger flares. A story spins up. Sharp words come out. Days of regret follow. But when mindfulness has been cultivated, a crack develops in that chain. The sting still comes. The anger still flares. But then, awareness registers it. And in that registering, a space appears where there was none. You may still respond. But now it's a choice, not a reflex. The Buddha spoke about this from his own experience in the Dvedavitaka Sutta, the discourse on two sorts of thinking. Before his awakening, while still training, he divided his thoughts into two kinds, those rooted in ill will, sensuality, and harm, and those rooted in their opposites. When he clearly recognized an unwholesome thought, he said, "As I noticed that it leads to affliction, it subsided." Not, as I fought it, as he noticed. As he saw clearly where that thought was heading, towards suffering, its momentum dissolved. The thought wasn't defeated, it was understood. And understanding, when it is direct and clear, has a power that force never has. The fact that the Buddha was describing his practice before full awakening is worth sitting with. This capacity wasn't given to him. He built it through training, and that means anyone can. But it also means that this skill, like any skill, has levels. A beginner catches anger 10 minutes after it started. With practice, you catch it after 10 seconds. Eventually, you catch it as it arises. The mechanism is the same each time. Only the depth changes. And that depth is what determines whether observation merely interrupts a thought or begins to transform the mind itself. We've seen that observation disrupts the conditions holding a thought together, and that the skill grows with practice. But here's the question that matters most. Does it matter how deeply you observe? The Buddha's answer was unambiguous. Mindfulness has depth, and the depth of your observation directly determines the depth of the change it produces. When the Buddha defined right mindfulness, he described 4 qualities that together determine how deeply awareness penetrates a thought. Sati, the basic registration that something is happening. Sampajanya, clear comprehension, understanding not just what is present, but why it arose and where it's heading. Anabhija, non-grasping, not pulling toward what feels pleasant. And Domanassa Pahana, non-aversion, not pushing away what feels painful. These 4 arise together, different faces of the same flame. When anyone is missing, observation stays shallow, and so does the change. With sati alone, there is a flash. Anger is here. The autopilot breaks, but the conditions that created the anger remain intact, ready to reassemble the moment awareness drifts. With sati and sampajanya together, observation reaches a deeper layer. Now you don't just know anger is here, you see why. This anger arose because I feel small. My sense of self is contracting. It wants to prove it matters. At this depth, you're observing not just the thought, but the conditions behind it. The anger hasn't disappeared, but the story it was telling you has lost its convincing power. You see it as a story, not as truth. and a story you can see through has far less power to regenerate. With all four qualities present, there is knowing, understanding, and spacious allowing. The anger is simply weather moving through a vast sky, and the sky doesn't need clouds to leave in order to remain the sky. At this depth, not only the current thought weakens, the pattern itself, the deep groove of habit that has been producing similar reactions for years, begins to erode. You are observing the very tendency of the mind to cling, to resist, to identify. And that observation loosens the roots that all such thoughts grow from. But reaching this depth requires a foundation. Trying to observe at this level without preparation is like trying to swim in rapids without ever having entered still water. This is why the Buddha never taught mindfulness as an isolated technique. He placed it within the Noble Eightfold Path, 8 factors that together create the conditions for deep observation. Right view gives direction, understanding why suffering arises through clinging and unconscious identification. Without this understanding, mindfulness becomes aimless. You're watching, but you don't know what you're watching for. Right intention shapes quality, the commitment to non-harm and letting go. Without it, you might observe your anger clearly, but still choose to act on it. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood create outer stability, because a life filled with dishonesty, harm, or conflict produces a mind too agitated to observe clearly. These 3 may sound like moral rules, but their function is deeply practical. They calm the mind before you even sit down. Right effort provides steady energy, the willingness to keep returning to awareness when you drift, to not give up when progress feels invisible. And right concentration gives the mind stillness and depth. A concentrated mind holds awareness the way a lamp in a windless room holds its flame, steady and even. Within this system, right mindfulness becomes more than a technique. It becomes the natural functioning of a mind that has been prepared from every angle. This is why someone who practices the full path can observe deeply in the middle of anger, grief, or chaos. Not because of superhuman willpower, but because the ground beneath their observation has been made solid. The Buddha gave this a vivid image in the Lonakapala Sutta. Drop a lump of salt into a small cup of water. The water becomes unbearably bitter. Drop that same lump into the Ganges River. The river barely notices. A mind that hasn't been trained is the cup. A mind cultivated through practice is the Ganges. The anger still visits. The fear still knocks. But the room that receives them has become so much larger that they no longer fill it wall to wall. Everything we've explored so far, the nature of thoughts, what true observation means, what happens when it meets a thought, and the depth that determines real change. All of this is the path. But where does it actually go? The Buddha was clear about this. In the closing words of the Satipatthana Sutta, he said that someone practicing the 4 foundations of mindfulness with genuine diligence could expect deep realization, and then gave a range: 7 years, 6, 5, down to 7 days, if the heart is truly in it. This is not a vague promise. It is a direct statement. Walk this path with sincerity, and the mind will transform. But what does that transformation actually look like from the inside? In the early stages, the benefits are tangible. You react less. You catch yourself sooner. The space between a trigger and your response grows wider. Relationships improve, not because the other person changes, but because you are no longer blindly acting out every impulse. There is more room to breathe, more room to choose. But the path doesn't stop there. For those who continue, observation begins to turn towards something unexpected: the observer itself. At some point, and this cannot be rushed, you begin to notice that the sense of "I am the one watching" is also just another experience arising in the mind. It comes. It goes. When you look for the one who is observing, you don't find a fixed point. You find only more observation, fluid, shifting, without a center. There is no permanent witness standing outside the stream. The watching is also part of the stream. This is where the Buddha's teaching reaches its deepest point. In the Anattalakkhana Sutta, he didn't just say, "Form is not self, feeling is not self." He said consciousness itself, the very faculty of knowing, the awareness that feels like it must be me, even that is conditioned. Even that arises and passes. Even that is not a self you can hold on to. When the 5 monks who first heard this truly understood, the text says their minds were liberated through clinging no more. Not through gaining a new experience, through releasing what was never theirs. This may sound like loss, but those who have walked far enough describe the opposite. They describe it as the most intimate discovery of their lives. The suffering that felt so personal, so uniquely yours, was resting on a foundation that, when examined closely, turned out to be empty. Not empty in a cold way, empty the way the sky is empty, vast, open, able to hold storms and sunlight without being damaged by any of it. And what remains is not blankness or indifference. It is a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, a freedom that can hold pain, hold difficulty, hold the full weight of being alive, and still remain free. Not because the pain has stopped, but because there is no longer a contracted self at the center, turning every experience into a personal wound. This is where observation leads, not to a place above life, but to a way of being fully within it, awake, without being imprisoned by it. What if you could observe your thoughts? You can. And when you do, they change. Not because you overpowered them, but because they were never as solid as they pretended to be. They were held together by conditions, and the most powerful condition was one you never noticed: the belief that they were you. The capacity to observe clearly is built through practice. Patient, honest practice. Sitting with your breath, day after day. Noticing the mind has wandered, bringing it back. Wandering again. Returning again. Without self-blame. Without impatience. Every time you sit down with kindness toward your own restless mind, you are already walking the path. And on the days when it feels pointless, remember, every moment of genuine awareness weakens the old pattern, even when you can't feel it yet. Change arrives the way dawn does, not all at once, but through a gradual lightening that, at some point, becomes unmistakable. The Buddha's very last words, recorded in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, were this: "All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence." In the original Pali, that final line is "Appamadena sampadetha." Strive on with diligence, with care, without complacency. Of all the things the Buddha could have said at the end of his life, after 45 years of teaching, he chose this. Not a philosophy, not a doctrine, a reminder. Keep practicing. The path is real, and every step on it counts. It can begin tonight, sitting down, closing your eyes, and simply listening to the breath moving through your body. That quiet knowing is the same force the Buddha followed all the way to freedom. It starts small, it grows with patience, and it has no ceiling.